Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well and had a lovely weekend and a good start to the week. So I think we'll give the others just a few more minutes to join us and then we'll get started. In the meantime, thank you for those who have been posting their student numbers in the chat. Those who haven't yet, please do so. And we will start shortly. Okay, I think that's most of us. So we're just going to get started. Thanks again for everyone for joining us. And we will be continuing today with Unit 7. If you remember, last week on Thursday, we started off with Unit 7 and we talked about data collection. This was now part 1. Because the unit is so long and it's quite heavy, so we ended up splitting the unit into 2 sessions. So today is essentially the part 2 to our study unit 7. Sorry. And we will be continuing with looking at the various data collection methods and tools, looking at important concepts around these methods, looking at advantages and limitations around these. So before I start, just to get some of the admin out of the way, for those of you who have not yet put your student number in the chat, please do so that we can keep track and record of all who are in attendance. Just to highlight again, as we get closer to the exam, that we do have the one-on-one consultations available. Thank you for those who have reached out and set out a consultation with myself. I'm really looking forward to those sessions this week. And if there is something that you've been struggling with as we've been walking through the study unit, and you feel it hasn't quite gotten together, whether it's just one concept, or it's a whole theory or a whole section, please, you're so welcome to really make use of the one-on-one consultations and just book a session and we can talk through it. Even if it seems like a small thing, I think it's better we ask and we know than to always have the question in our mind and never really get the answer to it. And yes, as always, I encourage us all to engage and participate, and to really do this learning together, because we learn by doing and by really participating and engaging ourselves in the process, not just like listening. So what I do appreciate is that you guys are actually following along with me in the study unit. So we might not always have engagements in the chat, but I believe that you guys are following. You have your study units open with you. You are going through highlighting, making notes as we go along, and all of this is really is exam prep. It's learning by doing, and by the time we get to exam revision, I believe that all of this we'll just need to do quick refreshers, and I think we'll do good. I'm very confident about our understanding of it. If there is anything, like I said, that you're not feeling confident about, please do reach out. There's really no other way of me knowing that you need help if you don't reach out. So yes, I'm here for this. I'm here for you. So please, make use of me, I suppose. Okay, so we'll get started if there are no questions. Okay, I don't see any questions. So we'll get started. I'm not going to recap Unit 6 because we did that last week. So maybe just to run through what we looked at in the first half of Unit 7 for the benefit of those who were not with us. We looked at how social science researchers collect data. We looked at the tools of measuring, questioning, and observing. And then we went into measurement and talked about the various levels of measurements. And just a note for those who were not here, we said that these terms concepts are very important to remember. They do come up quite a lot in the assessments. So please make sure that you have a good understanding of, the nominal level, ordinal, interval, and ratio level, and how to distinguish or differentiate between them, right? And then we said that, as with everything else that humans do, we are prone to make errors and mistakes, and research is no different. So the social science researchers really need to take into account two types of measurement errors. One, we said, was systematic errors, and the other one was random errors. So I'm not going to go into it too much, unfortunately. Like I said again, if you weren't here and you really want a deeper explanation of these terms, please do book a consultation with me. Okay. And then we talked about, sort of one of the first ways in which we can collect data. And we said that one of these is using existing data. And this is a very easy way to collect data, because you're essentially taking something that already exists, that's already there, and you're not necessarily having to go out and speak to people and physically collect the data, right? It's mostly a case of sourcing data that has already been collected. We looked at some of the advantages to that. And then we looked at some of the sources of this type of existing data. We said that there's primary data, secondary data, tertiary data. And yeah, I wonder if anyone remembers and can remind us what the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary data is. We had a very nice example last week. Well, I think it was nice. I don't know what you guys thought. Yeah, but can anyone maybe remind us about these three levels of data? Exactly. Thank you, Sandra. Yes, so the primary data is data that we're getting from the original source. So if someone recorded an interview and we get the recordings of that interview, that would be primary data, right? So I think just to note, and I mentioned this last week, is that just because it's from the original source, it doesn't mean we've collected it. It's still existing data because it's someone else collected the data essentially, right? But it's still original because we still hear the voices, or basically the original version of it from the source's mouths. Right, so that's what primary data is. Secondary data is, like Sandra said, an interpretation of the original source. So if someone wrote a paper on those recordings, and we use the paper that was written as our data, that is the secondary data. And then tertiary, of course, would be if someone wrote a report on that paper, and then we would use that report. So, it's really just about how far away from the original source is your data. Okay, and then we talked about the need for authenticity and credibility when we are looking at existing data, because we are not the one who collected the data. It becomes important for you as a researcher to determine, how credible is this data, because you weren't there when it was collected. You don't know what method was used. You don't know what situations was used to collect that data. So it becomes important for the researcher to ask a number of questions relating to the authenticity of the person as a source. So the actual person who is speaking in those recordings. You need to ask questions about the authenticity of the actual data, the data itself. Is this actually from someone that was at the crime of the scene, or is it from someone who heard someone talk about it? How authentic, how credible is the data itself? And then we look at the credibility of the sources. Right. So just to move ahead. And we talked about surveys versus field research, and we just said, that surveys is this collection of information based on, asking people certain questions. And we say that field research, on the other hand, is the researcher actually going out into the field or into the settings where you find your participants and doing the data in that space. And then from there, we went into interviews. Sorry, please let me know if I'm rushing through this too fast. I am trying to be mindful of time, but I also don't want, for the benefit of time, for us to lose out on important things. So if I am going too fast, please feel free to just tell me to, slow down, and I'm happy to do that. Okay, so then we looked at interviews, both in surveys and in field research, and we talked about various types of interviews. The first being structured and unstructured interviews. And we said that structured interviews are those that are, I think, as the name lends itself to its definition, is an interview that is structured. It is rigid, it has been planned to the T, and everything needs to go according to plan. So all the questions that had been planned need to be asked. They need to be asked in a specific way, and so there's really no room for any deviations from the plan, right? Whereas an unstructured interview, again, as the name suggests, is that those interviews where you have some flexibility. So hello. Hello. Can you guys still hear me? Sorry, I think my network just popped out for a bit there. Can someone please confirm if you guys can still hear me? Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. Lovely. Great. Okay, so just to continue then, we're talking about unstructured interviews and how they are really the opposite of structured interviews. So the researcher, you still go in with a plan, you still go in with prepared questions, but you allow yourself to deviate slightly from the questions depending on the situation. So if you find that there are things that are coming up in the interview that was not necessarily part of your plan, you sort of allow the participant to delve into that, because you understand that there might be something there that may be really valuable for your research. So the unstructured interview really allows the participant to bear it all, in a sense, of course, within the confines of the research setting, and just within the boundaries of what that interview is meant to fulfill. Sorry. And then we went into in-depth interviews, we went into focus group interviews, and just to note that the focus group interviews, really, as the name suggests as well, is that it is an interview in which you have a group of people, and we are recommended to have between 6 to 12 people in the group. And it's a good way to really gauge opinions of people on a specific topic. But what we did highlight with regards to this type of interview is that when people are in a group setting, their reactions tend to be very different to what they would be in an individual settings. We influence each other, and so you have the possibility of people not really responding genuinely, or responding from their own point of view, because they are worried about what everyone else in the room would say, or they don't want to be the odd one out. All right. So I think we close that section off by highlighting that focus group interviews can actually be used in combination with other data collection methods, and that really so I suppose makes up for the gaps in this particular data collection method. All right, are there any questions on that? Okay, I don't see any questions, so we're going to move on. Still on the topic of interviews, we then looked at the various types of questions that are asked in these interviews. So we have what we call closed-ended questions, which are really just your yes/no questions, or questions that only require one answer. So multiple choice questions are also are sort of closed questions. So it's not just that they require one answer, but that they don't give space for explanation. I think that's more it. So if you were to ask participants, who's your favorite political party, and you give them a list, that question doesn't allow them to basically expound on their answer. They can't really say DA because da 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 da. No, it's closed, so it's just DA and that's it. And then we have open questions, which are the opposite of closed. And of course, from that, we can gauge that we are giving the participants an opportunity to actually explain their answer, to tell us a little bit more. And we've got free narration questions, which allows you to, or which prompts your participant to take you through a story. And this is also a nice way. It's a type of open question that really allows a participant to get comfortable, because you're essentially asking them about their story. So if your research is about high school and bullying, or something like that, you can, instead of asking participants, what do you think about high school bullying, you can ask them, tell me about your experience with bullying in high school, and they can really dig deep into that question. And that is followed by role playing, which, as the name suggests, you sort of ask the participants to imagine themselves in the shoes of a particular person, and basically ask them, if you were in this situation, what would you do? So with the bullying case, if you were the bully, how would you feel if someone did this, or someone said that? And it's a nice way to also really get the participant thinking about something from an alternative perspective. But through this, you're also gauging what their attitudes towards certain things are. And then finally, we have follow-up questions. And of course, these are more your prompting questions. So if someone gave you an answer and you want to find out more, you would, pose a follow-up question around that. Okay. So I think this is where we are actually starting for today, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So how then do we go about conducting these interviews? For those of you who were here last week, can you please confirm? Because I've bookmarked this slide as where we ended. Can you please confirm? Just so I don't go into depth with something that we've done already. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so then we ask ourselves then, how do we go about conducting these interviews? So the first thing we need to know is, or that we are told, is that there are a number of questions that you as a researcher needs to ask yourself, right? And the questions are about the interviewer and the interviewee. So in terms of who's going to conduct the interview, sometimes it might be your research, but maybe you don't have time to go and conduct the interview, so then you need to find the people who will, or basically, or maybe you're not skilled in you don't speak the language of the participant, so you need to find someone who speaks that language who can go and do the interviews, right? So asking yourself, how will that person be able to establish rapport and trust with your respondents? Will they be able to maintain anonymity for the participants? And then you need to ask yourself questions about the people itself, issues such as the difference in gender, age, race, physical appearance, or language. Ask yourself, are these things going to influence the interview? And if so, how can you minimize it? So for example, if I'm doing a study on men and their emotions, how men handle emotions. And I'm a woman wanting to interview a man. From the get-go, I can already predict that it's going to be difficult for these men to open up to me, right? Because I'm a woman, and a group of men are not going to find themselves doing that easily, unless I'm a very skilled interviewer, from a psychological background, and I've had years and years of experience in this field, like Dr. Shaida Jensen, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with her, but she is the head of something at Unisa. So she's really great, and she's done a lot of work on men's health and men's emotions and all that. Just a side note. So yeah, you need to think about the context of your interview and what things are going to stand in the way. Also, if you're a younger person and you're wanting to interview more mature people about their experiences, think about how that will be received, or even the opposite is the case. If you're a more mature researcher and you're wanting to interview teenagers, they're going to respond to you very differently as then they would respond to someone who is more on their age. So, these are the things that the researcher needs to think about and try to minimize the risks of. And then we think about who else should be present in the interview. Is it just going to be you and the respondent? Is there going to be someone taking notes? Is there going someone recording? Or are you allowing the person to bring a friend that they feel comfortable with? So things like that is also things to take into account. And then finally, of course, who are you going to be interviewing? So, of course, you would have already gotten your sample, right? When we talked about sampling, you'd have identified the criteria for the people that you're interviewing. So, yeah, but that's something that also needs to come up, and thinking about the circumstances of the interview. Yes, and then I think there's just a bunch of questions that I think maybe I should not go through all of them in too much detail, but really, I suppose the gist of it is, as a researcher, you want to have asked yourself all the questions around your interview, so that you're not surprised when something happens or a question comes up and you have the answer for it. So of course, like things like where the logistics need at the minimum, your logistics need to be covered. So is it a group interview? Is it an individual interview? Where's the interview going to be? Is it at the participant's house? Is it going to be at a cafe somewhere? Have you gotten the relevant permission? If you're working with children, have you gotten consent? Have you gotten assent? Have you gotten ethical clearance? All of those things need to be sorted beforehand. So really a successful interview depends on advanced planning, lots of planning. Basically needs to cross all the T's, dot all the I's, to ensure that once you are actually in that room, that everything is in order, right? So yes, as you go into the interview itself, we are told that it's important to make it very clear to the participant what the purpose of the interview is. Of course, we talked about in our session on ethics, we talked about the importance of not deceiving participants and not doing any harm. So it's important that people know what they're walking into. If you told them that you're doing a study and you're asking about men's emotional health, you can't get into that interview and start asking them about their sexual experiences. It's not in line with what you told them initially. So it needs to be consistent, and so the respondents need to be able to trust you as a researcher, especially in social science research, when we are working with the more deeper things of the human psyche. It's important to establish that trust and rapport with your respondents. Yes, and then what also becomes important to do is really having a pilot test. So most of the time, if we think of big projects, You'd rarely see a government or an institution carry out a big project or roll out a big project without having first tested it, right? Or done a pilot test on it. So with the pilot test, you essentially will get a small group of people, of course, who fit the criteria of your research, right? So you'll get those people, you'll have your questions ready, and you'll basically, I suppose, test out the instrument, test out your questions, and it gives you an opportunity to see that are the questions clear enough? Do people understand what you're asking the question? Are you getting the kind of information you need from the question? So really, this pilot phase allows you to practice every single element of your research, even including your devices, right? So you may be using a new tape recorder. This is a good opportunity to now test it. Does it work? Does it have good playback? How's the sound? Are you going to need mics? You know, all of those logistics things is good to test during the pilot stage, so that when you do your actual interviews, you know that everything is sorted. You know that the room that you're in doesn't bounce off sound, or that the participants are comfortable, that all the basically all your T's have been crossed and I's have been dotted. Are there any questions on this part of the interview stage? Okay, so I don't see any. Okay, maybe I'll wait a bit. I'll give it a minute. It's always so strange when I ask if there are any questions, and I think a part of me is still used to the classroom setting. So immediately if there's a question, you would see someone's hand go up, right? Or someone will say something. But now I always have to keep in mind that, okay, you guys are, needing time to still like type it, think about the question, think about what we've just talked about, type something out and stuff. So that takes a bit of time. So I'm mindful of that. No, that's okay, Anine. Thanks. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to what the advantages of conducting interviews are. So as we know, interviews being a social interaction between two or more people, and we know that with social interactions, they are so unpredictable. Like you can have a solid plan and someone asks this, but people are complex, and things don't always go according to plan. But the interviews are really, really great because they are flexible, especially unstructured interviews, right? They're flexible, so it allows you to work with those things that come up, the unpredictable stuff that come up. Sorry. The unpredictable stuff that come up during the interview. At least your unstructured interview design gives you the space to adjust and change course, right? We're also told that because interviews involve dialogue between an interviewer and a respondent, unclear questions can be clarified. So if you have a question and it's not so clear, you right there you can actually break it down to the respondent and say, oh, this is actually what I'm asking, or simplify it in a way that they can understand. And we can't do this with something like a questionnaire, because you're not there as the researcher. So the Sorry, I think I got kicked out again. Okay. This is again one of those things with the whole online thing. On one day it's good, and the next day it's the internet is just But anyway, so yes, and also another advantage we are told is that you can ask follow-up questions, right? So it's again, especially now in unstructured interview, if you've asked a question and you get a very brief response or yes no response, you have that freedom to actually ask or prompt the participant for some more information about that. You're able to establish rapport. We're told that the respondents don't have to be literate, so they don't need to be able to read or write to participate in an interview. As we know with the questionnaire, you can only people can really only participate in a question if they can read and write, and especially if they can read and write that language. So if someone's home language is not English, then and your question is in English, then they can't participate. But in an interview, even if your questions are in English and you find that this person's home language is Afrikaans, you can actually then in the interview, ask the question in Afrikaans and then get that person's perspective as well. And then a really nice one that I like is that nonverbal communication can be observed and noted. So we know that communication, I think I don't know what the percentage is, but I think, is it 70% nonverbal cues, right? And 30% verbal cues. So that means a lot of what we say falls in what we do, in what we're doing, our facial expressions, our gestures. So in an interview, you can see all of that. So if you ask them a question, they're saying no, but they're like kind of nodding their head, but they're saying no, you can make a note of it. That's, there's something there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person means yes, but they're saying no, but it just means maybe there's some uncertainty there and it's something that you can do a follow-up on. And so those are some of the advantages. I'll encourage you to maybe go and read through them yourselves at a later stage, but just for the purpose of time, I'm going to move on to the limitations of interviews, right? So the major thing is bias. Bias, we can't really escape it in research or in life, really, because we are ruled by our biases and we're always operating from a space of bias. So yes, bias is a problem. As an interviewer, you might hold a biased opinion towards, the person that you're interviewing because maybe of anything, their race, their age, their gender. We have preconceived ideas about certain people from certain groups or who speak certain languages. And so we don't realize it. But as you're interviewing, that those biases can infiltrate into the interviews and really change not only the way that you interact with the participant in an interview, but also the way that you end up analyzing their questions. So it becomes very important for the researcher to be aware of their biases and to note them down. Yes, and biases are not always bad. They can also, sort of a positive bias can also affect or influence your research, because if someone is saying something, right, the participant's telling you a story and you're nodding and smiling and like, yes, it's sort of egging them on. That might lead them to start exaggerating their story, right? Because now they're getting excited. They're like, oh, this person enjoys what I'm telling them, or, I'm being really helpful for this person's research. So you never know that they might end up just like exaggerating their story, adding bits and pieces that aren't supposed to be there. So things like that will influence your findings at the end of the day. And it's not to say that you must now be, what do they say, stiff, right? As a researcher, of course, you want to make the respondent feel as comfortable as possible, but it's important to just realize that any movement or anything that you as a researcher do is going to influence how that respondent is going to react, and it's, at some point it is going to influence the research, but there's nothing you can do about it, really. The second thing is that face-to-face interviews are costly, and we know this. If you're needing to interview 50 people, and meet them at their various locations. That means you're traveling out. It's transport, it's time. If they are meeting you or you ask them, then they need to, bear the cost of that. So it is very expensive to put things together like that. You need to make sure you have, if it's a long interview, maybe, some snacks. You need to have your recording equipment. You need to have a quiet space. So just all of those logistics make it a bit expensive. And you also need to have a certain level of skill to get really honest and detailed responses from the participant. So interviewing is a skill, actually. So if the researcher doesn't really have that skill, then they might not get the kind of information that they need. They might not get rich data that they need because, maybe they didn't realize that at a certain point that, this was a good time to actually ask a follow-up, or, they could have linked that with something else that the participant said, and then, try to get a better understanding. So, yeah, it's a skill that, not everyone has. So that then becomes a disadvantage because if you don't have that skill, then essentially the data you're going to get isn't going to be the best. And of course, the final one is that you can't interview a large sample. So mostly in studies where they are doing interviews, you'd find it's quite a small sample. We can't interview 100 people unless you are a team of researchers, right? Unless it's one of those national projects where there's a team in every province and, people going out then. But in that case, of course, it's very expensive. But generally, you wouldn't be able to interview a whole lot of people if you're doing interviews only. And then we looked at we are told about limitations of phone interviews. I'm not going to go too much into that, but just to highlight that sampling is another big thing here, especially sampling bias, because if you're doing phone interviews, it means you're only reaching people who have phones, right? And that's maybe not everyone, and maybe you're only reaching people who have registered numbers, and that's of course not everyone. So, that's an issue. And of course, there's the aspect of people not being very comfortable giving their information to some random person who just called them. I mean, I've had this experience in the past few weeks. Someone called me and she said she was doing research for some company, market research, and started asking me all these questions. Where do you live? What do you do? How much do you earn? Do you have a car? All these questions. And at some point I was like, I feel very uncomfortable sharing this type of information because yes, you're saying you're a researcher, but I don't know you. It could be a scam and I could just be feeding someone information, and then next thing I know, someone comes and robs my house because I've, shared this information with them. So, I mean, I think 5 questions in, I said, sorry, I don't feel comfortable. And I ended that conversation. So this is essentially a risk that you take if you're going to do phone interviews, right? Because people don't know who's on the other line. There's no way to verify that it is an actual researcher. So, there's that lack of trust in situations like that. And then, I think just the last few points is just that the response rate, because of the reason I just mentioned, the response rate is usually very, very low with phone interviews. And of course, you can't see the person's nonverbal behavior, like the woman that called me for her research. I was saying, yes, I can answer. But, in my mind, I was rolling my eyes because I was like, oh my gosh, how long is this going to take? I'm supposed to be doing my work. This is so annoying. So you can't really gauge that. And you also can't have a long phone conversation. No one wants to be on the phone for more than, I think, 10 minutes, with some researcher. I think you only want to be on the phone for that long if it's a friend or family, not someone that you don't know and now they're taking so much of your time. So those are some of the limitations with phone interviews. And honestly, I don't think they come highly recommended, just because these are such big issues and you really don't yeah, the response rate isn't really great at all. Okay, are there any questions on that or any comments even? Have you guys had experiences with phone interviews, and how has that been? Yeah, definitely lots of eye rolling. My first question is always, sorry, where did you get my number? Because I don't remember giving my number to any market research company, right? So it just feels intrusive, like you said, Fiona. It just feels so intrusive, like someone out there is just handing my number over to companies. And I guess, yeah, that takes us into a whole nother discussion about privacy and, access to personal data. But yeah, that's a story for another day. Yes, and the timing is always so bad. It's always before go into an interview, into a meeting, or you're just, yeah, the timing is not great. So yeah, at some point I tend to feel bad for the person on the other side. So I'm like, they're just doing their job, or they need to do this research. But on the other hand, it's so, yeah, it's just so inconvenient for me, especially if I was not aware of it. No one, emailed me in advance and told me, hey, we got your number from this place. Can we call you at this particular time? This is, all the standard things that you'd expect to be notified of in a research project, right? At least someone to tell you what the research is about, when they're going to call, who they are. If you have any questions, who do you reach out? Now you just get this phone call, and this person rattles off something that you don't really fully understand, and next they're asking you a bunch of questions. So yeah, phone interviews I'm not a fan of. Thanks for sharing your experiences, ladies. Okay, so now we're going to questionnaires. And questionnaires are print, or they tell us it's a printed document, but of course now we know that doesn't necessarily have to be a printed document, but it contains instructions and questions and statements that are compiled to obtain answers from respondents. And so, yes, basically they are either, in the olden days, I suppose, they used to be distributed by mail, and printed out and distributed to different people. But nowadays you mostly get them not even just by email, but someone just sends you a link. Hey, please fill out this questionnaire for me, and you can quickly do a SurveyMonkey or Google Forms, and then just submit that. So when it comes to the wording of statements, and questions in questionnaires, the researcher needs to be very careful, because remember, one of the limitations that we talked about is that with a questionnaire, you're not there to explain things to the respondent. So if they don't understand a question, there's no way for them to get clarity from you. So it becomes very important for the wording that is used to be very clear. The questions must be very clear, so that the person isn't sitting thinking, oh, I wonder what this person is actually asking me. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but on page 187, we get a list of things that should be avoided, words that should be avoided, types of questions that should be avoided. Something like a loaded question should be avoided. And we talked about question types. I can't remember in which session, but you'll see sort of the same kind of questions come up. Loaded questions, leading questions must be avoided, negative items, just questions that are ambiguous, that are not very clear, or that's going to make someone have to sit down and think for more than 30 seconds about what the question is actually saying. Of course, things like incomplete questions must be avoided. Lengthy questions, very long questions tend to lose people. So it has to be very short and brief and to the point. And then questions that actually has assumptions should be avoided. And something like that is, why do you think the DA is the best political party? That holds the assumption that the DA is the best political party. And the respondent might not have that same belief. But now, because the question has been phrased in a way, and it's not an open question in that, the respondent can't really say, actually, I don't think that's right. They sort of feel like they have to answer within the confines that they have been given. So then they'll say, it basically alters their natural response. And then abbreviations should be avoided, or jargon and slang, things that are very specific to the research community or the professional community must be avoided, because you can't assume that everyone knows what you mean. And the example we're given is something like, if you say, what do you think is the effect of AA in the community? And someone is thinking, Alcoholics Anonymous. Meanwhile, you mean the Automobile Association. Things like that, which will just confuse someone. They're like, AA, like, what do you mean? So abbreviations must be avoided, and just very specific terms. If it's very legal terms, those must be avoided, because you can't assume that the everyday person knows what's a legal thing. I don't even know legal terms. I don't even know legal terms, so I can't even give an example. But yes, just things that are very specific to a particular profession or to a particular field should be avoided. So Lizette tells us that sensitive questions about personal info, respondents are reluctant to answer because it makes them feel uncomfortable. Exactly. So it must be rather kept at the end to not put the respondent off. Exactly. And it also poses the question of, like, what kind of questions can you ask in a questionnaire? Because more sensitive questions is much better to ask in an interview, because a physical interview, because you can sort of build up to it. You establish that rapport with the person. You first ask them very basic questions, general questions, until they're comfortable with you, and then you can sort of start going into the more sensitive information. But in a questionnaire, like, I don't think people will be as comfortable to fill out very sensitive information unless it is anonymous. So you don't ask them for their name, their phone numbers, and things like that, where it's just answer the questions and submit, and no one will know where it came from. Maybe people will be more willing to answer those kinds of questions. Oh, that's a very good one, Fiona. So Fiona says she's filled out a questionnaire which assumed she would answer in a specific way to a closed-ended question about, if you're stressed or not. And all the questions after that were now related to how stressed you are, which was an obvious error in planning. Exactly, because what happens to the person who right from the get-go says, no, I'm not stressed? So the rest of the questions then don't apply to them. Then what's the point of that? So those are the type of questions we want to avoid. All right. Okay, Lizette says, is that not a control question? What do you mean by a control question, Lizette?
So I'm just putting my mic on.
Mm-hmm.
So when the survey or researcher or the questionnaire, the researcher is trying to establish maybe a certain pattern in the person, then in the one section of the questionnaire they would ask, the same question but structures the same word to measure stress, they would use the sentence in different ways, and that is how they control to see if stress is actually associated with drinking. So I don't know if that makes sense. In a questionnaire, if a researcher is trying to establish how drinking affects or how stress is influenced by drinking, they would ask in the questionnaire the same kind of question but structured in a different way to establish the consistency.
Yeah, so but I think then that's a different case because of course, as researchers, there's always going to be their assumption. I mean, from the get-go, from our research questions, we have assumptions, right? So there is the assumption that stress influences drinking influences stress. So, whichever way that goes. But if your question, it shouldn't come across strongly in your question. Right, and I think what Fiona was alluding to is that a question like the one I mentioned, where it's like, why do you think the DA is the best? That is, you're basically putting an opinion on the participant. I don't know if that explains it well, but yeah, you're putting the opinion on them, and basically the whole questionnaire is structured on this assumption that this is how the person would have responded, right? But I suppose it becomes different if you have sent these questions to a particular group of people that do deal with this. So, for example, if it's an Alcoholics Anonymous group, and you're wanting to find out, how stress has played a role in their alcoholism, then I think that's a different case. But we know for the most part that with questionnaires, we're trying to get from our previous units. We know that with questionnaires, we're trying to get as broad a sample as possible, so you don't have much control about who's going to end up with that particular questionnaire. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered everything on this slide, and we just said that last one, just to ask one question at a time. Of course, sometimes you find there are two questions in one question, and that confuses the respondent because they would say yes, and then you don't know if they say which question they're saying yes to. So is the South African government working well and contributing to healthcare? Right? And then the participant says yes. Yes to what? Are they working well? Or yes to, are they contributing to healthcare? Right? So in that then becomes very difficult because you're asking two things essentially. So in that case, it would be better to just break those questions up and make them two. Okay. So in terms of the structure or the process of conducting a survey, we're told that, I think we were told this already, that what a questionnaire is. What does this say? I'm very confused now. Why does the slide look so similar? Okay. Sorry, that's my bad. Yes, and we talked about the wording of statements and questions. Although here, yes, okay, we are given different types of questions that should be asked. So in the first, maybe to clarify it for myself as well, in the previous slide, we talked about the type of questions to avoid. And then here we are given, what kinds of questions can be asked. And I am looking at time, so I'm not going to go through it too quickly, but if you'll follow with me, we are on page 189, and the first one is called paired comparison questions. In this type of question, the respondent only selects the opposite. Okay, maybe from the top. Of course, we know that we've got closed questions that you give the respondent to options. So, do you have access to the internet at home? Yes or no? Right. And then we've got paired comparison questions where the respondent only selects one option, but actually has to think about the options and compare their meaning. So this is a lot more complex, and this is kind of what we find in our assignments and exams, right? The kinds of questions where you have to sort of think about each option and try to basically walk through it and see if it makes sense. So the example that we've got here is that the police want to extend their services in the community. As a member of this community, if you had to choose between the following two options, which would you prefer? And then they say either more regular foot patrols in the street or more officers on duty where children hang out. So there, you're given two options. Yes, it's a closed question, but it's two options that you actually need to apply your brain a little bit on. So it requires a little bit more engagement than something as simple as, do you have internet access at home? Right. Then we've got contingency questions, and these are questions that only apply to some respondents and therefore must include clear instructions. And perhaps that is what the researchers of the questionnaire you filled out, Fiona, I think this is what they then had, contingency questions. So if you do answer a particular way, and then it sort of takes you down a different path, and if you answer a different way, then it takes you another path. But I think maybe what they didn't do is make provision for that alternative path. Perhaps the assumption was that all people would go down one answer path, but it's important to then say, if no, jump to this question, and we've seen that. So have you nursed a cancer patient before? Yes or no? If yes, continue answering the question. If no, please skip, these questions and jump to the next, the question after that. So that's quite a nice way of, I suppose, accommodating for the various types of responses that you can get. Yeah. So then we've got ranking questions, which are also closed-ended questions, but instead of selecting one option, respondents are required to rank or order the options from least to the most. So this, again, it requires a little bit more from the respondent, a little bit more of brain work. So you're given a list of options, and you kind of have to rank from, what's more important to you to what's least, or what you prefer most. So if they ask, which political party do you prefer, rank them from most favorite to least favorite, and they give you a list of options. It doesn't give you the opportunity to explain why, for example, ANC is at the top and DA is third. It doesn't give you that, but it does give insight into your preferences and how they are ranked. And then we've got inventory questions. An inventory, again, a type of closed questions. So you'll find that with surveys, there's a lot of closed questions, right? So surveys, closed questions, primarily because you don't have the opportunity for open-ended questions, because people are not going to want to write an essay in a survey. If you're asking them, please, tell us how you feel about this. If it's a survey, I know personally, I don't want to spend more than 5 minutes on a survey. So once you start asking me to write out stuff, I don't want. So maybe that's just me, but I think that's the general consensus. So that's why you have a lot of closed-ended questions in surveys, so that even though some of them do require some thought, it's still something that they can do quite quickly. So with inventory questions, I suppose it's more your multiple, what we term multiple response questions, right? So you're limited. So inventory questions are also closed, but again, the respondent is not limited to selecting only one, right? So the purpose of the inventory question is to obtain a comprehensive view of all possible options that could apply. So here, It's more like, you know, which political parties do you like, and you list everything, and you even give a blank space for if there's anything else that the participant wants to add. So you basically allow them to tick as many boxes. Yes, exactly, Lizette. So you allow them to tick as many boxes as, you know, as they feel. And if there's something that you haven't thought of, then, you know, they can add that for you, and that also adds to your data. So then we've got, of course, multiple choice questions, which we know, you know, you tick the one that applies. So, okay, so inventory questions, you tick all that applies, and multiple choice, you tick the one that applies. And then we've got the Likert scale, which is more a type of ranking scale, where, yeah, they're basically these 5 categories, and I think we've all come across a Likert scale. So it's either strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, and you ask a range of questions or make a list of statements, and then the respondent can basically say where they fall on the continuum regarding this. And it's a good way to collect attitudes and opinions of people. So, for example, if you're wanting to evaluate, to get opinions, evaluate, you know, how people feel about a particular class, about a particular shopping mall, about customer service, things also have a lot, usually use Likert scales a lot. So, you know, the cashier was friendly and knowledgeable. That's a bad question because there's 2 there. So if the person says agree, I don't know if they're agreeing to knowledgeable or to the cashier being friendly, right? So see how it's so easy to make these question mistakes. But yes, so you would make a statement, and then the respondents just checks basically where on the continuum they feel. Sometimes I'm lazy and I just say neutral for everything, which is not a great thing to do because it doesn't really help the researcher. So yeah, when I try to not do that, but it seems like the easy way out. Okay, so we've got Likert scale, and then we are given a number of steps with regards to, so here I'm actually jumping for those who are following in the unit. I'm jumping past the ordering of questionnaire items. I'm jumping past the scale and requirements of reliability and validity, just because we did talk about that. And yeah, I'd encourage you guys to maybe just go in and read on that. I just thought we will not get to the end of this unit if we cover every single thing. So these sessions are an overview, as I've said before. So the things that we don't cover, you are encouraged to go in and read up on. Okay. So we are given a few steps of things to think about when it comes to conducting a survey. And maybe just to run through it quickly, the first is to ensure that we have a measuring instrument, you know, or the thing that we're going to use for our survey. So it's going to be your interview guide or your questionnaire. That is the instrument. That's the thing that is going to, that's going to go out there and really be used as a tool to collect this data. We talked about conducting a pilot test. For those who are following, sorry, I am on page 198. So we will then go and conduct a pilot test of the instrument, because especially with questionnaires, I think you'd mostly find pilot tests being done with questionnaires more than with interviews, just because with the interview, even if you find that, okay, something in your interview guide isn't working, or there's questions that are not working, you can quickly rectify that in the interview. Especially in your first interview, you'll see what works and what doesn't, and then you can rectify that for the next interviews. But with the questionnaire, we don't have that option, so that's why it becomes important to do that pilot test. You send out the the questionnaire to people, you see what the responses are, you get their feedback also on, their experience in answering the questionnaire. Were there words that they didn't understand? Was there questions that weren't clear enough? Was it too long? Was it too short? Was there, questions that they wish were in there that relate to the topic? Were there questions that they felt was like, why is this here? It's so, it's not relevant. So those are things that data will help you to then refine your questionnaire, so that when you send it out to the broader population, you know that you've got a solid instrument, right? Then you would test the reliability and validity of the instrument, and then consider the timing of the survey. Yeah, so for example, we don't even need to give an example there, because we've just talked about how, the timing also plays a role, because you could be really interested in helping the researcher and in, participating in the research. But if the timing is off, you're not going to be in the mood if they call you during your dinner time, or if you have a meeting in 5 minutes and they call you, it's not going to be a good experience. So the researcher needs to think about the timing when they send it out. It's similar to, I suppose, what the companies and their social media posts. Like, I think they've come to understand that there's certain times where social media use is on a high. It's usually like in the evenings, right? So that's when you will post out something, because people are online. If you're posting something at 9 o'clock, most people at work, most people at school, you're not going to get a lot of engagement. That's just something I realized. So yeah, it's important to think about the timing, because your timing is going to determine the response rate that you get. And of course, we want the highest response rate. So the timing needs to be really good. Okay, so what are the advantages and limitations of questionnaires? I'm gonna speed up a little bit here, because we still have to go into observation, and yeah, that's going to be our final section. So I think we've talked about most of these already, the advantages of using questionnaires. Yes, we know that it saves time and it saves money, because you're not physically having to go and speak to every person. You just send out an instrument, and people reply. We know that you can reach more people, so you reach respondents who are geographically dispersed, especially with e surveys. You can reach literally not just anyone in the country, but anyone in the world, right? And they are particularly useful if the purpose is to investigate topics that are very personal or sensitive, especially, so if it's a anonymous survey and you want to ask personal things, sometimes it's easier to, just tick a box than it is to explain to someone that you don't know. Okay, the limitations, like we said, is the low response rate, the slow response rate as well, because it's easy to also procrastinate, right? When we have a survey, like, oh, there's this thing I must fill out. Yeah, I'll do it later. And then later never comes, or, the researcher has to send multiple reminders for it to come back. So that's the thing about sending stuff out. Getting it back is an issue. And then you don't have control on the nature of respondents' responses. Yes, you don't have control over that, unfortunately. Yeah. And then where we are sort of introduced to the concept of group administration, which is when you get a group of people in one space, and then you administer the questionnaire, right? Or you give them the questionnaire. And so the advantages of this is you'll get a high response rate because everyone is in the room. So yeah, I mean, that speaks for itself. People can't really escape if they're in that room and they are given this thing. And sorry, the data collection time is short, so you take and everyone, we only have 30 minutes, and people know, okay, it's going to be a short thing, it's quick, it's going to happen, and then I can go on with my day. And you have the opportunity to verbally explain what the survey is about, and answer any questions. So I guess it's a nice mix between an interview type, we get the advantages of the interview where you get to explain, where you get to do, collect your data on site, and you get a high response rate, and the use of actually not having to individually sit with each of those 50 people, but just giving them this questionnaire. Right. Are there any questions on that? Okay, I think there's no questions, so we'll just move on. Okay, now we have the wonderful observational techniques, which I think is one of the most interesting but most time-consuming ways to collect data. So, yes, essentially observation, if the word speaks for itself, it's you are observing, right, people mostly in their natural settings, in their natural environment. You as a researcher go in to observe. So we observe, we are told that we observe every day. If we see our friend coming and we see that her face is looking a little bit off, then we know something's wrong, right? These are like little observations we make. But for observation to become scientific, there are 5 conditions that need to be met, and we're just going to quickly run through it. So the first is that the observation must be guided by a purpose, which should be specified by means of hypothesis and research questions. So, we'll know this from our discussions on, setting up a research question, defining our problem. We know what we are wanting to look out for. So you need to know what you're looking for before you go in and start looking for something, right? So if you go into that classroom, the maths classroom with the students, you need to know what exactly in that classroom you're looking for, and that is going to be defined by your research questions. Secondly, the observation must be related and guided by scientific theories. So it's not just, I want to see how people act. It's what is it based on? What sort of thinking, what scientific theory are you coming in with? Basically you must have a theoretical foundation for what you're observing. It can't just be, I want to see how they act. Is there a theory out there that, has hypothesized that the way that teacher-student relations affect, the students' grades, there must be some sort of theoretical thinking behind your observation. Otherwise, you're going to go there and just sit and watch, and not be able to really link what you're seeing with a theory, which is, the core thing about research. We link our observations or our data with theory, and we put them together to try to make sense of a phenomenon. Thirdly, the procedures to be followed during the observation must be systematically planned. As with everything else in the research project, we need proper planning. So I can't just go into the class. Before I even get to the classroom, planning needs to have taken place, right? Because you can't just walk in. You need to have gotten ethical clearance. You need to have gotten consent from the teachers, from the parents of the students, from the school, from the Department of Education. It's a long list, right? Before you even get into that classroom. And then once you get into that classroom, you need to know the structure of how things work in that classroom. So you need to probably have had a meeting with the teacher and ask them, what the dynamics of the class is, how does class work, what's the timing, what's the best time for you to come. And once you're there, you need to know then what exactly you're looking for. Even if and at this point, it becomes important to be very specific about your observation, because we can't just say, I'm looking at teacher-student interactions. What about it? because you're going to sit in that classroom for 5 days and you're going to see millions. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but you'll see lots of teacher-student interactions because this is the space. But what about that, especially in particular, are you looking at? So that needs to be really, really clearly defined before you even go into that classroom. Fourthly, the actual procedures followed and deviations from the original plan must be systematically recorded. Of course, we know that not everything's going to go according to plan, but everything then must be documented. If we said that, we planned to sit in this classroom for 2 weeks, but we only ended up sitting in for a week and a half, that needs to be recorded because it deviates from the plan. And you need to basically be able to account for it in your write-up. And then fifthly, where possible, the observation must be checked. This can be by a supervisor or even the teacher in that classroom. Maybe at the end of the day, you can go and say, hey, this is what I observed today. Can you maybe clarify, is my interpretation correct? Because that's the thing with observation is you're watching and you're making interpretation based on what's happening. So it might, of course, it's based on theory, but it might not be actually what's happening. So this is where it becomes a bit of a gray area because I see that student was rude to the teacher, and then, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this student has a negative attitude towards the teacher. This means, this could mean da 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 da. And then you don't have anything to really confirm that. So it's good to maybe go to the teacher and maybe that teacher would be able to say, no, this student is always like this, like literally with all his teachers, he's like this, that then you can add that note so that you're not making judgments based on just your own thinking. There needs to be someone to basically verify and validate your observations. Yes, your structure can be adapted, and this, I think, is the great thing about qualitative research. It can be adapted. The key thing is just that you make a note of it, that, this was the initial plan, but of course this happened and, I made the decision to do this, and, be able to motivate the changes of the research. All right, and then we've got different types of field research. Yeah, the first being, or the most popular ones being participant observation and non-participant observation. And the words really, I like that these concepts, they really kind of speak for themselves. So participant observation is, this type of field work where you as the researcher go into a particular setting to observe, but you don't just observe, you actually participate, right? So hence participant observation, you're observing as a participant. So if I am, observing a group of swimmers, a team of professional swimmers, and I want to be in their space, I'm going in, I need to swim, basically. I need to do what they do. I need to basically live as one of them, right? That's how I'll get sort of that inside information, not just being inside the team, but being part of the team, right? So what I thought was very cool was my supervisor for his, I think it was his master's. He was observing a group of rappers, the local rappers from the Cape Flats, and he got to spend time with them and also in that process, because he was doing participant observation. So it wasn't just that he was spending time with them, which was like so cool to me, but also he got to be one of them and, write raps and join them in studio and make beats and stuff. So at the end of the day, he got out with research and some really cool beats. So yeah, I was like, you could actually be a rapper one day. He found a hidden talent there. So that was cool. So yes, that's really what participant observation is. You become part of, so you really get a different type of understanding when you're not just watching people, but you're actually doing life with them, right? So that's participant observation. But still in that process, we must still remember that we are researchers, right? So I'm sure my supervisor had fun doing that research, but at the end of the day, he was still a researcher and he still needed to be systematic in his observation. He, made sure he had his tape recorder with him. He was making notes. So it's not like you get there and you suddenly forget that you're a researcher and now you're like, yeah, I'm one of the boys, you still need to remember that you are a researcher in the space. It's just that you are participating in the activities of your group. Okay, so everything still needs to be noted down. Conversations need to be noted down, need to be recorded. Field notes need to be made of everything that is significant to the research. And then the opposite of participant observation is non-participant observation. And this, of course, is just the opposite, where you are just going in as a researcher and you're just observing. So when the rappers are making beats, you're just sort of in the corner and you're writing your notes and you're watching them and you're not necessarily doing anything with them, right? So you're observing from a distance. Yeah, so that is non-participant observation. And then we've got ethnographic studies, and this is a type of participant observation where the researcher's aim is to describe a particular group's way of life from that group's point of view in its own setting, right, in its own cultural setting. So when doing ethnographic research, the researcher is interested in the characteristics of a particular settings and in how people create and they share meaning. What are their customs? What are their beliefs? How do they go about doing a life? But so it's not just the observation. Of course, you'll be making field notes, but you'll also be conducting interviews. So yes, you're with people, but you're in the group and you're observing, but you're also interviewing people. You're like, oh, you find someone who is maybe significant in that group and you say, hey, can I sit down and interview you? And you get a lot more information from that person. And you can ask them about things that you have observed. And this is a nice way to also check. Remember what we said, that one of the things about observation being systematic is that it needs to be checked by someone, right? So those interviews will allow you to basically bounce off your observations of someone in that community. So yeah, I see that, every, Thursday night, this tends to happen. Can you tell me more about it? And that person can basically also fill in the blanks. So more the historical blanks that you might not be aware of. Okay. And then we've got audience ethnography. Okay, just a note, I know that it is 7 and people are starting to leave out. So we've got maybe only 2. Yeah, we've got 1 or 2 more slides. I am going to finish it so that we're not still holding on to this on Wednesday. For those who do need to leave, thank you so much for joining us. And you can watch the maybe last 10 minutes of the session in the recordings, and Adele has posted the link to those recordings. So yes, you're welcome to go and just catch up on the last bit that you missed. But yeah, thank you and have a great evening. Okay, so for those of us who are still here, we are looking at audience ethnography. And how audience ethnography really tries to describe how audiences experience something, right? So how do they experience radio or television programs in the social context of everyday life? So this, of course, depends on your study. If your study is around media and you want to see how people react to various media sources, you will then do an audience ethnography where you're not necessarily watching these people in their everyday lives. You're watching them interact with media in their everyday lives, right? So when people are listening to the radio, how are they acting when the radio comes on, when certain songs come on, when certain presenters come on, or when, certain radio stations come on? What is the reaction? What are the attitudes that come up? So you're basically watching how they engage with a particular type of media. Yeah, and not anything else in the outside situation. Okay, and then we've got street ethnography. And street ethnography, I think, as the word says, it's not necessarily you're in the street, but it's just to say that you're literally out there with people, right? You're literally out in what could be unconventional settings with people, so such as a street, a shelter, a hostel or boarding house, and you're there and you really want to describe the way of life of these people. So I think important to note with ethnography is you're trying to describe the way of life, right? It's not necessarily the type of research where you want to get solid solutions. It's a type of descriptive research where you really want to shed light on how this group of people live. Of course, if there are issues, if there are problems that community is facing, that will come up in your research. But yeah, your aim is really to shed light on this group or this culture of people, and to really, I suppose, educate others about it. Yeah, so it's not necessarily that you start off with a problem, but yeah. Yeah, even with so they say we can also spend time with sex workers, drug dealers, or street children. But the issue with this is then, how do you access those groups, right? Because these are your more I suppose, marginalized groups in society, and they might not feel so willing to speak to a random person. You need to establish some solid rapport with maybe a significant member in that community, maybe the leader of the pack, which who will be able to convince everyone else to let you into the group. Because remember, not everyone's going to just allow some random person saying, I'm from this university and I want to, spend a month with you guys. And they don't know who you are. If they do some illegal stuff, how sure are they that you're not going to call the cops on them? So it's things like that makes street ethnography quite challenging, actually. Okay. And then we've got reactive observation versus non-reactive observation. And I think these are just, they are variants of each other, I would say that. So reactive observation is this observation that influences the behavior of the people. So most of the time you can't really avoid it. And we talked about the reactive effect. We talked about the Hawthorne effect. I hope we all still remember the Hawthorne effect, the fact that when people know that they are being observed, they would tend to change their behavior. So reactive observation is if you as a researcher come in and your style leads to, people changing their behavior. So those people are not going to be comfortable for the whole month that you're there. They're going to be talking in a certain way, dressing in a particular way, because they are, your presence is causing this reactive effect. And on the other end, of course, you can do observation in a way which is, non-participant observation, where you're kind of at a distance. So you can't, yes, they know that you are there, but they don't really see you all the time. So you're observing from a distance, and this is a bit more, so this is non-reactive, because they might remember you're there once in a while, but for the most part, they're just going about their lives as they usually do. So that's usually a good way to conduct observation. Are there any questions? No. Okay, I don't see anything. I think we're wrapping up. Okay, and then we've got, sorry. Yes, so this is the last. And then we've got, we are just told about how do we go about actually conducting field observation, despite the structure that we choose to take, right, or the approach that we choose to take. It's important for the researcher to one, have a proper plan in place. I think this will probably be like the big takeaway about, from this module, is that every stage of research requires intense planning to the core, and the researcher needs to have their measuring tools in place, the observation tools in place. So what if you're going to use a tape recorder, ensuring that, I suppose your more logistics things, ensuring that you've got enough batteries, ensure that you've got backup, ensure that you've got mics, because you might not hear people clearly. So if you've got one primary respondent, the person that you will be following everywhere, it's good to give that person a little lapel mic or something, so that you hear, when you're going back to listen to the data, that you hear everything. Otherwise, it's just wind, especially when people are moving around. And I had that experience when I did that with some high school children. And by the end of the day, when I listened to that recording, I was so sad because it was just wind. All I heard was wind and just like bits and pieces of the people of their conversation. So that really didn't help me. So that's, obviously a result of insufficient planning. So I had to do better the next day. So yes, but then most important is, as you're going in, is to know exactly what you're going to be observing, right? And I think we mentioned this previously, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it's important to know what we're observing, and there are different types of things that we can be looking out for. So you can be looking at external or physical signs, such as, the clothing of people, their lifestyle, the occupation, haircuts, just these things that you can see from the outside, tattoos, if these things are significant to your research, then of course you'll be looking out for them, right? And then you'll look at kinesics, which is the use of facial expressions, gestures, and bodily positions as non-verbal communication. So, of course, this is all in relation to what your research project is about. So if something like, how people, what the postures of people are as they communicate is something that, is related to your research, then you'll be looking out for those things and making notes of those things. The only issue with this is that when it comes to the meanings conveyed by kinesics, is that, especially those that regulate conversations, that it's culturally specific. So if you're not part of that culture and someone, does a particular gesture, you think it's this from your understanding, but in that person's culture, it might be something else. So I suppose a good way to counter that is to have these interviews afterwards, right? So that you can say, oh, I see that, you guys did like the peace sign, what does that mean? Because to you, it might be peace sign, and they might tell you, oh, it means, the cops are coming or something, or something like that. So, these things are group specific, culture specific. So it's important to get that clarity from your participants. Exactly. Like no eye contact, right, in some cultures. So you might see, oh, the women in this family don't make eye contact with the men. I think, that they are scared of them, or, so you, as a researcher, we all have, of course, our own biases, our own understanding of things, but we might not understand that in that culture, that is a sign of respect, and it's not necessarily that like she's scared of the person, she just respects them, and there's a big difference there. So yeah, it's important to not let your understanding as the researcher infiltrate in what's actually happening in front of you. And then we look at proxemics, which is, what are the things that signify status, power, ownership in social interactions. And here you're really looking at, how are people interacting? What are the basic power dynamics in the space? What are people using, as a status of symbol or as a status of they've made it type of thing. Yeah, and again, all of that in relation to your research project. And then finally, language behavior. If you're doing a linguistic study, of course, if you're looking things like, silence, what does silence mean in particular settings? How is silence used? How are jokes used? How is laughter used? Some people use laughter to as a coping mechanism. Some people use laughter to ease up situations. So different types of things in relation, of course, to your research study. All of it has to go back to what is the core of your research topic. What does your research topic asked you to look at? And that's the things you're going to go into your observation looking for, so that when you're observing this group of rappers, you're not noting every single thing that they do. You're noting specific things. You're like, okay, language use is something I'm looking at with these rappers. How do they use language in their everyday lives? How do they bring in these certain phrases from their raps into these things? Then I'll look at maybe how they dress, and how does that coincide with their language, behavior, and their ideologies, etc., etc. So it must all flow, it must all link to each other. You can't be looking suddenly at that rapper was with his girlfriend today, now I make a note of that. What bearing does that have on your research? How does that contribute to your research? It doesn't. So yeah, it's important to know what you're looking for, because I think if we just think about it, when you find yourself in a space and you're observing people, you see everything, right? But with research observation, you need to be specific. You need to have a bit more of a narrow view of what you're looking at. So otherwise you're going to have tons and tons of data that you won't know what to do with, because they have no bearing, so they don't relate to your research in any way. Okay. And then so we're asked sort of how are observations recorded, and I think, so they just talked about classification. You need to be able to classify, the behaviors or the things that you've observed into certain categories. For example, the categories that we just looked at, so you can at least use those as themes, and basically chunk everything that you observe and that you've noted under language behavior. You can put it under that theme. Everything that you've noted under dress style, you put it on that theme. Everything that you note about like street cred or how people view wealth in the rap community, you put it in that. So that gives you a way to sort of structure your data, so that it's not everything is all over the place, but you're putting each thing in its little pocket, so that when it comes time to analyzing that data, at least you know where everything fits. And then you will select or devise instruments to analyze said data. Yeah, and then finally, if we look at sort of the advantages and limitations of observational techniques, the advantages, and I think we get this as we were speaking through it, is the advantages all depend on if the researcher was able to get into those community, right? Especially if it's a close-knit community, are you able to get in? Once you get in, things are much easier. Whether the thing that you're observing actually takes place frequently enough for you to make observations on it, right? So if it's something very specific that you're looking for, I want to see how they use the word aware, in their everyday lives. And then you find that actually they don't use it that much, you're not going to get enough data there. So you need to see that the thing that you're observing, it must be something that happens frequently, so that you can get enough data on it. And then the technique that you will use to record the observation. Of course, if you're only using field notes, so you're making notes, it's very easy to miss out on stuff, because you might you know, I mean, we don't write very fast and we can't write everything that's happening. So it's always good to have, you know, maybe you're making your notes, but you've also got a recorder on someone, you know, yeah, a mic on someone, or you've got a recorder playing, so that if you missed something in your notes, at least the mic picked it up, right? Or the recorder picked it up. Yeah, so those are sort of some of the things to think about with observational research, and we're told, you know, about just the importance of finding a balance between not influencing the participants, respondents too much, because you still want them to behave as naturally as possible, even though you are there, but you also can't observe them without telling them, right? It's that ethical issue there. So finding ways to conceal or to not make your presence too intrusive into the process becomes then important in this technique. Okay, I think that's it then for today. Thank you for you guys who stuck through. On Monday we're doing unit 8. I did not update that. On Monday we are doing, on Wednesday. On Wednesday we're gonna do unit 8, and then next week Monday unit 9, Wednesday unit 10, and I think that takes us to the 12th, right? So by the 12th we'll finish the study unit. Yay! So we'll finish the study unit on the 12th, and then we've got a week to do exam prep. So we're going to use Monday the 16th, and Wednesday the 18th, and Monday the 23rd to do exam revision and prep. I'm still going to think about how we're going to do it, because it's, yeah, usually when we do it in class, it's really helpful. So I'm going to need to think about how we can do it online. So if you guys have any ideas, please let me know how we can do that. I like to usually go through previous exam papers, and, you know, we do like a closed book tests in the sessions, but of course we can't do this now in the online space. So I'm gonna just think about it, but if you guys have any ideas, please let me know, so we can still have like a productive revision session. We've got 3 days, we're gonna have 3 revision sessions, because you guys are writing on the 25th, I believe. Yeah, so we'll have 3 revision sessions, and I think that should be enough. If there's anything between that time that you guys want to chat about, please make use of the consultations. Yeah, or just send a message. Sometimes we don't just need a whole consultation. It might just be you want me to clarify something, then I can type out an email, and that's also fine. We don't actually have to like meet or like have a phone or a Teams meeting, okay? All right, so thank you so much, guys. I'll see you on Wednesday with Unit 8. Have a good Monday. Bye.